Hello everyone, welcome to our 7th meeting. Good to see so many of you here. And as you've noticed, we are switching our attention to the Middle East. And could I just say that we need to close the meeting at 9:15 sharp for reasons I won't bore you with. But if you would bear that in mind during the break when you're submitting questions, and we'll try to get the Q&A underway, because I'm sure you will have a lot of questions for Sir John Jenkins, whose profile you've seen for months, and you've been reminded of it tonight and in recent emails. And as you can see, he's got this remarkable sweep of experience across a variety of Middle Eastern countries. And just before we came in to this space, he had a little chat in Arabic with Zina, our student, who is from Egypt. So his language is still in fine fettle, but I think he's promising to speak in English for the duration of the evening. So that won't be a problem for any of you. And he's going to be. You can expect tonight a wide-ranging view of the Middle East, though inevitably it's going to be focused on conflicts that we are so well aware of. And during the Q&A, he will welcome questions from you. You can ask him questions as he says, he doesn't have to answer them, but he would welcome any questions that you may have that go beyond the very specific conflicts that we're aware of in the Middle East. And so you can think from Morocco to Iran, if you like. And even you can include Turkey as well. So that's the broad sweep of tonight. And without further ado, please welcome Sir John Jenkins.
Thank you very much, Bill. Is the sound all right? Yes. Good, okay. If it's not, just shout or throw things. The title of the talk, The Changing Geopolitics of the Middle East, it could apply to any talk I might have given over the last 40 years. But the reason we chose and agreed the title is because when we were talking about my coming up here to talk, I didn't quite know where we'd be. I think it was about 6 months ago we started talking about it. So all I can say is that I made a good call by choosing as general a title as possible. The war in Gaza, of course, was already well underway, but that in Lebanon wasn't. We hadn't seen the acceleration of the Israeli campaign of decapitation, as it's called in an unlovely phrase, against Hamas and Hezbollah. And Iran had not yet attacked Israel directly. And of course, we also didn't know who the next US president was going to be. And now we do. So, as Bill said, what I'm going to try and do this evening in 40 minutes, which is not much for a region as complex as the Middle East, is talk about current conflicts, why they arise, what the root causes may be, what this says about the current stability of the region as a whole, and what this means in terms of any future resolution of these conflicts, and indeed any new security order, something that people in my profession have been talking about to no effect for at least 50 years. So I first went to the Middle East in 1981, a year after I joined the Foreign Office when I was learning Arabic, which seems a very long time ago, because it was. And there are three really striking differences for me about the modern Middle East and North Africa compared with when I first joined the Foreign Office in 1980, or when I first went to the region. First, there is a general and striking demographic shift. The population of the region, which means basically from Morocco to Iran, in 1980 was around 200 million. Today, it is nearer 500 million, with a range of median ages in the population from about 30 in Kuwait to 19 in Sudan and 21 in Iraq. So population growth has been immense, and it's a young population. Some places it's younger than others, but by and large it's much younger than anywhere in Europe, the United States, Japan, and so forth, and even probably China. And you combine this with the expectations that young people have for their future, for jobs and so forth, for families, for prosperity, and also the range of climate and other environmental stresses we see around the region in terms of rapidly rising temperatures and water shortages. And this doesn't look like an inviting platform for future stability. But the second difference is the economic success and increasing political influence of the states of the Arab Gulf. And I say Arab Gulf advisedly. If you talk to Iranians, they will keep you in conversation for hours until you admit that it's the Persian Gulf. I once spent an hour in the foreign ministry in Tehran not getting beyond first base because we couldn't agree what to call the region we wanted to discuss. Saudi Arabia has always been a special case, of course, because of its status as the site of the two holiest mosques in Islam. The person we call the King of Saudi Arabia is, in Arabic, the guardian of the two holy places. And its claim to have been almost uniquely a wholly self-created, righteous Islamic state for 300 years from its foundation in the 1740s, from both Ottoman and British imperial control. But the other 5 states of the GCC were still seen 40 years ago as small and politically backward energy producers, which would remain dependent for their security on the West, which meant, in particular, the US and the UK, for the foreseeable future, and might even eventually be absorbed by one of their larger neighbors. Well, what a difference 4 decades makes. And to be truthful, impressively intelligent and agile, if authoritarian, and often autocratic leadership make. The third difference is the eclipse of the major Republican states of the Arab North, so Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. In 2 of those states, Syria and Iraq, protracted conflict has clearly played a massive part. But in all 3, we had already seen by the end of the 1990s a dramatic decline in their political weight, something that was partly a function of their long-term economic weaknesses, exacerbated, of course, in the case of Syria and Iraq by international isolation, but also because of endemic repression and the rise of other, at least socially and economically freer, centers of gravity. For the past 15 years, the country most young Arabs would like to live in and would like their own country to resemble, according to the annual survey of Arab youth, which is conducted by a polling and consultancy company based in Dubai, so it's heavily weighted towards the Gulf, but by and large, the trend is indicative, is the UAE. And now we have the beginning of what could be, and I say could be, advisedly, a remarkable social, if not yet domestic, political transformation of Saudi Arabia, and a new willingness by the leadership of the kingdom to take risks, justified or otherwise, both military, as in Yemen, and politically, as in Sudan, the recent outreach to Iran, and most recently involvement in what's called the Arab Quint, which is the 5 Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, and the UAE, set up to lead the region in its approach to the conflicts in both Gaza and now Lebanon. And there is perhaps a 4th related point, which I'll try and address briefly later on. Apart from the US, which is a special case, the 3 states that have done most to shape the security order or disorder in the region over the last 20 years are all non-Arab: Israel, Iran, and to a lesser extent, Turkey. And they each lie in different ways at the heart of the current interlocking crisis in the region. That crisis is commonly seen as arising from the inability of the parties concerned and the international community, by which most people mean the US and its allies, to resolve. So if anybody wants to ask me if the international community exists, you're welcome, but the answer might be long and obscure. To resolve the Israel-Palestine dispute, which has been a source of conflict in the region and more widely since the foundation of Israel in 1948. And in some ways, even as far back as the early 1920s, after the Balfour Declaration, when mass Jewish immigration into what was about to become Mandate Palestine really began, causing severe communal tensions. I have a slightly contrarian take on this. I do not myself believe the Palestinian issue is the fundamental cause of regional instability. The region has been searching for equilibrium since the foundation of the modern state system in the 1920s, so essentially from the 1921 Cairo conference, when Winston Churchill, as a newly appointed colonial secretary, essentially created Transjordan, mandated Palestine, and agreed to the French mandate in Lebanon, to the settlement of the borders between Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and what became Saudi Arabia towards the end of the same decade. And even today, there are underlying political, territorial, and resource disputes between Algeria and Morocco, Egypt and Sudan, Iraq and Iran, Iraq and Turkey, Iran, the UAE, and Bahrain, Bahrain and Qatar, Yemen and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman and Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Iraq, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and so forth. Neither Syria nor Israel has precisely defined borders with Lebanon. Plus, there is the issue of national identity. Islamic, Islamist, nationalist, Ba'athist, monarchist, or in the case of Iran, Islamist mystical. But I also think that the Palestinian issue is something that needs resolving before other, perhaps more structural problems can be addressed. And that was Yasser Arafat's great, if perverse, achievement, in my view, which was to resist co-option in the 1960s, when the PLO was founded in 1964, by one or other of the great regional state rivals, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or Syria, and to frame the issue of independent Palestinian self-determination at the same time as Islamic, secular, and progressive, a contradictory combination. A combination, though, that nevertheless retains a unique capacity, as we have seen over the last year, to mobilize passions within and outside the region in a way nothing else can. That enabled Arafat to appeal effectively to pan-Arab and pan-Islamic sentiment. But by making the costs of both success and failure so high, and indeed by seeking a freedom of action that antagonized powerful regional states, as he did with Syria during the Lebanese civil war in the 1970s and 1980s, it also made resolving the issue far harder. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the Madrid conference in 1990, the Oslo process, which followed Madrid, the Wye River Agreement in 1998, or Camp David in 1999 to 2000, Arafat, unlike other Arab leaders, never felt able to compromise enough. He had globalized Palestine, but in doing so, he had also made it extremely difficult to reach consensus. And over time, this lost him the support of most Arab leaders, who increasingly sought to prioritize their own domestic concerns. And with the rise of an uncompromising Palestinian Islamism, which is the modernist ideology which seeks to create a comprehensive system of reimagined Islamic governance, in Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in parallel to the rightward shift in Israeli politics, which has been very noticeable since 1990, which constitutes a dialectic of the devil, the issue has become even harder to resolve. So what happened on 7 October 2023 marks for me a genuine inflection point in not just Israel's internal politics, but also the broader geopolitics in the region as a whole. And I should perhaps say at this point, of course, that the massacres of 7 October, which were not actually unparalleled in Middle Eastern history. I mean, you can go back to the massacres of 1860 in Damascus of the Christians by the Druze, plus the 43,000 deaths to date reported from Gaza, and the smaller but still considerable death count in Lebanon, are all horrifying, irrespective of how many are combatants and how many civilians. The same, of course, is true of the 600,000 plus deaths, the 5 million plus refugees and 7 million internally displaced since 2012 in Syria, the maybe 100,000 deaths and 11 million displaced in the brutal civil war in Sudan, the death toll in Yemen and Libya, and so forth. This all raises serious humanitarian, ethical questions, and indeed legal questions, highlighted again when we have just seen Bashar al-Assad condemning Israel's actions with breathtaking hypocrisy earlier this week at the Arab and Islamic Summit in Riyadh. It is also, to be brutally frank, the manifestation of a generalized political, social, and economic disorder in the region as a whole, just as the Balkan Wars of the 1990s and the current conflicts in the Sahel, and indeed the war between Russia and Ukraine, reflect certain forms of chronic and still unresolved political disorder there. The task of policymakers is to reflect on the causes of this disorder and seek ways to address them effectively. Whether they do so, of course, is another matter. Before 7 October last year, so before the murderous Hamas attack on the kibbutzes and villages around North Gaza, it looked to many as if we had reached a stable disequilibrium in the region. Israel's domestic turmoil had, of course, taken up much of the available political oxygen for months, as Netanyahu and his coalition partners sought to essentially eviscerate the Israeli judiciary. But both Netanyahu and many others within Israel's national security establishment seem to have believed that Hamas could be contained. The organization, according to this view, was primarily concerned with consolidating its position inside Gaza. Its ultimate goal may still have been to take over the West Bank and displace Fatah as a dominant force in Palestinian politics. But that was a problem for another day. Its access to Qatari cash and mediation and its long-standing working relations with Egypt and Turkey gave it something to lose and brought a welcome degree of predictability. From time to time, when Hamas decided it needed to flex its muscles by firing rockets in a display of performative aggression, Iron Dome, which is the Israeli air defense system, was there to intercept them. And more or less everyone went home happy. Just as in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Féin and the IRA was seen by many as the best bulwark against dissident republicanism, so Hamas could act, according to this theory, as a bulwark against Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Allowing Hamas to build its own sub-state with Gulf money, Palestinian Authority financial transfers, and revenue from private sector employment in Israel, the theory went, might bring a sense of responsibility. It would also make it wary, at least in public, of taking to Iranian, that is, to bellicose, a line on general issues of Palestinian liberation, and the judicious adjustment of economic safety valves by issuing more or fewer work permits and reopening the Erez crossing, which is a crossing at the eastern end of the Gaza Strip, which is the civilian people crossing, as a reward for an understanding that Hamas would reduce friction, would regulate any incentives to seek Iranian cash. It would also keep the warring wings of the Palestinian national movement, Hamas and Fatah in particular, entirely apart, thereby also reducing the risks of Israel being pressed too hard to agree a final settlement of Palestinian claims. That was all an illusion, of course. It seems highly likely, not least from what Hamas leaders themselves have said, that a major driver of the attack was a sense that Arab support for what Hamas regarded as the liberation of Palestinian land had weakened, as evidenced by the Abraham Accords, and increasingly serious suggestions that even Saudi Arabia, which since 1948 had been one of the firmest supporters of the Palestinian cause, even at its most violent. It's also likely that Hamas leaders, most notably the military wing, had concluded that the Palestinian Authority, the residual beneficiary of the Oslo process, was so completely discredited that now was the moment to strike in order to assert Hamas's political primacy. It may be, And some published documents and first-hand accounts support this, that Hamas genuinely thought that Hezbollah, which had been the major focus for Israeli military planners for the past decade, and Iran would inevitably be drawn in, and they could at last strike a decisive blow at Israel, which they saw was hopelessly divided. This was, in turn, an illusion. Hamas, like many others, underestimated Israeli social solidarity. They underestimated the resilience of the Israeli Defense Forces. They underestimated, and still do, the extent to which Israeli military planners had indeed learned lessons from 2006, the Lebanon War in 2006. And they underestimated the way Israeli politics had shifted. Most Israelis had already lost faith in any two-state solution. After 7 October, that is now the position of the vast majority of Israel's Jewish citizens. All polling tells us so. I say Jewish citizens because 20 to 25% of the population of Israel is Arab. This has paradoxically helped Netanyahu. He inspires a deep loathing among Israeli liberals, a shrinking minority these days, but also among otherwise hawkish Israelis who fear an assault on the institutions of the state and have no love for the settler religious right. In polling over the last year, there have been consistent majorities in favor of him stepping down. There has been a general strike. There have been mass demonstrations. There have been repeated emotional calls for Israel to make a deal with Hamas to bring the surviving hostages home. And yet Netanyahu is still here and still in charge. His approval ratings even show some recovery, and the war continues. 2 former Israeli Defense Force chiefs of staff who had migrated into national politics, Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz, resigned from the cabinet over the summer. 2 weeks ago, Netanyahu sacked his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, another former IDF general with a formidable reputation as a fighting soldier. He has been replaced as a coalition partner by a man, Gideon Saar, with very little real military experience, and his place as defense minister has been taken by another military amateur and political hardliner, Israel Katz. Meanwhile, the extremist factions of Bezalel Smotrich and the Kahanist provocateur Itamar Ben-Gvir retain their positions. And the war continues. This may simply be a reflection of Netanyahu's mastery of the political dark arts and his opponent's naivety. But it may also suggest something more complex, the way in which the current crisis has become not simply a test for Netanyahu, the dominant figure in the Israeli politics of the last 3 decades and the longest-serving Israeli prime minister ever, beating Ben-Gurion, I think, 2 years ago, but for the country as a whole, for the region and indeed for the world. Many people think Netanyahu does what he does simply because he wants to survive politically and neutralize as long as possible those who want to see him on trial for corruption. But there's an equally strong case, I think, that Netanyahu's baser political interests and the higher interests of Israel as a Jewish state, as Israelis themselves now understand them, intersect in increasingly complex ways. When 7 October happened, many commentators compared the shock to that caused by the surprise Egyptian assault on Israel in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. There was the same sense that Israel had fatally underestimated its enemies. But 1973 led, largely thanks to Kissinger, to a series of disengagement agreements and then to the 1978 Camp David agreement with Egypt, which effectively meant that Cairo abandoned its championship of the Palestinians in return for peace. Egypt was expelled from the Arab League, but in retrospect, Anwar Sadat's decision to prioritize domestic issues over external adventurism looks prescient. Hamas and Fatah and the other Palestinian factions have over the last 2 decades become simply one more sedimentary layer in the political geology of the Middle East. And for most other Arab states, economic restructuring to meet the challenges of a youthful population, the energy transition and climate change is the real imperative. They look way beyond the confines of the Arab League, the US or Europe, towards China, India, Brazil, South Korea and Central Asia. And standing in their way is not Israel, it is Iran. Iran was the great winner of the regional calamities of the last 23 years. Afghanistan under the Taliban, however unpleasant their rule is not the threat it was to Iran in 2001. Post-Saddam Iraq and Lebanon, especially after the Doha Agreement of 2008, which was brokered by the Qataris as an example of their statecraft, gave Hezbollah, in effect, a veto on government decisions in Beirut. Syria is again the gateway to the Mediterranean, which it was for the Sasanians, Rome's most potent enemy, and the distant ancestors of the current Persian elite, in the 7th century AD, and a conduit for weapons transfers to Lebanese Hezbollah. In Yemen, too, the Iranians have re-established a presence where a governor once sat over 1,000 years ago. In 2015, the Saudis thought they could push Iran back in Yemen, and they were wrong. Now they and their GCC partners simply want Iran to leave them alone while they get on with reforming their economic and governmental structures. But the conflict that started on 7 October last year has made that far harder and has also exposed Iran itself to risks it clearly thought it could manage. Israel has had impressive success against all its enemies over the last year. But the problem it now faces is how to capitalize on this when every political option seems to involve concessions to the Palestinians, something wildly unpopular within the country and indeed anathema to much of its political elite. I was in Jerusalem in 2003, and I remember vividly the rejoicing when Saddam Hussein was captured in a hole in the ground near his hometown in Tikrit. But in Iraq, controlled by Iran and its friends in what are called the Popular Mobilization Forces, a group of Shia militias who generally owe allegiance to Tehran, or I should say to the supreme leader in Tehran, is a far more challenging proposition for Tel Aviv than the brutal Ba'ath tyranny that in practice acted as a block on Iranian expansionism into the heart of the Arab world. And the same goes for Syria. And the result of the collapse of Ba'ath Party authority in both countries has been a rapid growth in the more or less permanent Iranian presence, the creation of religiously indoctrinated militias, massive logistical support for Hezbollah, and with the Houthis in Yemen acting as backup, a gradual but apparently inexorable Iranian encirclement of Israel. The IRGC, the Republican Guard, and its allies have been hit hard, but still have formidable military assets in South Lebanon, parts of southern Syria, and within ballistic missile striking distance of Israel in western Iraq. The IRGC have also been attempting for some time to infiltrate weapons from Syria through Jordan to Hamas and other Palestinian militias in the West Bank. Last year, they nearly succeeded in getting a massive landmine to groups of militants in the West Bank who were planning an attack on an Israeli military convoy at Megiddo, which is otherwise known as Armageddon. And so the dilemma for Israel and for Netanyahu is this. It has been clear for years that Iran is the main threat to Israel's survival. The Palestinians can damage Israel, but they can't destroy it. Iran can do both. And as it moves closer to building a nuclear weapon, or even just a threshold status, something which regular IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, reports and increasingly caveated statements from Tehran itself continues to suggest, it will feel itself more and more immune to outside pressure. Iran has harnessed the power of the Palestinian issue and that of the Twelver Shia, which is a sect to which Iranian Shia belong, in Lebanon, the Alawis in Syria, and the Zayedis, a different sect of Shiism in Yemen, in the service of both its expansion in the region and its campaign against Israel. Israel cannot defeat Iran. It is simply too large, too far away, and too populous, with a tenacity and resilience born of revolutionary zeal. Plus, its relationships with both China and Russia have evolved over the last decade to the point where they look semi-permanent. Israel can deter this coalition for a time, and it can cause a lot of damage, not just to Hezbollah and Hamas, but also inside Iran itself, as we have seen over the past few months. But what then? Israel cannot rely on the Islamic Republic collapsing under the weight of its admittedly serious domestic contradictions, even if it were to launch a successful attack on its nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and elsewhere. The Praetorian state Khamenei has put in place to protect the increasingly unpopular revolutionary Islamist ruling elite may not be entirely united, but it's almost certainly too strong and would itself seize power rather than see the revolution through which it has become very rich and very powerful overturned. We saw something similar in Lebanon and Iraq in 2019 when popular protests against repression, incompetence, and religious terror were brutally repressed by Hezbollah in Lebanon and in Iraq by the largely Iran-aligned Shia militias. An achievable strategy for Israel might be to start by nullifying Hamas and prevent it from ever returning to rule in Gaza, and then do the same to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that does, in fact, seem to be what Israel is now trying, with some success. But that has already been massively costly in human lives and material damage. There have been reports that Hamas and Fatah have come to an agreement to allow a technocratic recovery administration in Gaza. But that begs a multitude of questions about Hamas's real intentions, Fatah's capacity, funding, and the attention span of the international community. In addition, for any sustainable solution, Israel needs to know it has the unconditional long-term support of the US. That has become questionable even with a second Trump term. Israel has shifted further to the right than the US. Trump's victory was not really shaped by external issues, and if it was, it's Trump's distaste for US entanglements in other people's conflicts that made most difference. And all polling shows far less sympathy for Israel among younger Americans than their parents. In addition, every US president since Obama has said he wants to get out of the Middle East and focus on China. Trump is no different. That may not be sensible or indeed achievable, but it looks like a firm bipartisan position grounded in serious concern about China. And that in turn, along with the mayhem in Gaza, is making the Gulf states nervous of any sort of new normalization initiative with Israel. But as we saw with the response to the first Iranian missile attack upon Israel earlier this year, in order to withstand Iran, it helps Israel to have the strategic depth and regional cover only the key Arab states can provide. Saudi Arabia is central to this. Israel also needs Jordan and Egypt to stand firm. But Netanyahu's insistence on controlling the Gaza-Egypt border, his refusal even to consider a new plan for the day after in Gaza, or for wider Palestinian political autonomy, and increased settlement construction and alleged IDF and settler abuses in the West Bank and Jerusalem have infuriated both countries, who have their own highly volatile domestic constituencies to consider. Meanwhile, Iran also has seen its strategic choices become more complicated. Its aim over the last 2 decades has been to defend the Islamic Republic from the US and to push the US and its allies out of the region so it can exercise what it regards as its rightful hegemony over the Gulf and exploit its position within Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to squeeze and eventually destroy Israel, thus bringing to fruition the triumph of its own vision of a righteous, Islamized regional order in permanent opposition to the leaders of world arrogance, at least in part. The trouble now is that Iran's constitution of an external protective perimeter, policed by its partners in Hezbollah, the Assads, the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, and most recently the Houthis, who also act as shock troops against Israel and the US, and as facilitators of Iranian predatory economic extraction, doesn't look quite so clever. Assad himself may be starting to look more perhaps to Russia than to Iran, and the Gulf states are certainly offering incentives to him to turn away from Tehran. It turns out that Hamas and Hezbollah are far more brittle than many thought, and the IDF far more professional. It's also clear that Israel has penetrated with patient, daring, and highly skilled intelligence work, not just Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, but also the heart of the Iranian regime itself. Israel can clearly get to anyone, anywhere, anytime. Plus, it can hit Iran from the air and from distance, as well as through assets on the ground, with almost total freedom, especially now it seems to have taken out Iran's air defenses. And in addition, Iran's domestic situation is pretty grim. The economy is stagnant, inflation rampant, and while it can smuggle oil out, it is heavily discounted, which is great for buyers like China, but not so much for the national finances. Plus, it is clear that probably a majority of the population is heartily sick of being told what to do by a remote, old, and brutal clerical elite backed up by the vicious thugs of the Basij. So where does that leave us? The underlying fractures in the region have been clear for some time. The GCC states are seeking to develop and diversify their economies in new and innovative ways in order not merely to meet the aspirations of their mostly young citizens, but to take advantage of a world where economic growth has shifted away from the US, the EU, and even Japan towards China, Southeast Asia, and India, and to hedge against the risks of the energy transition and climate change, already having a major impact in terms of rising temperatures. In southern Iraq, I think this year they hit 45 degrees. Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon are essentially failed states, exporting Islamist radicalism, subaltern violence, drugs. Captagon, which some of you may have heard of, is now the major export earner for the Syrian regime. It's methamphetamines, basically speed. And millions of refugees. Others, Algeria and Tunisia, for example, in different ways, have stagnated or regressed. Egypt, which was once the leader of the Arab world and still has a plurality of its inhabitants, is locked into long-term economic decline, with the army acting as a drag anchor on any attempt at reform. And that provides an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to take its place as not simply a religious, but also as an economic and political leader, and its dynamic, if sometimes, how do I put this, mercurial crown prince. But Saudi Arabia, like its Gulf neighbors, is constrained by fear of Iran, which claims to offer alternative leadership to Muslims, both Shia and Sunni, globally, and regards itself with a population of 90 million against Saudi Arabia's 21 million Saudi citizens, an ancient culture and an ideology of revolutionary, not quietist Islam as a real regional hegemon. That was the reason for last year's deal between the two, brokered by China. And it's the reason Riyadh is so keen now to keep close to Tehran, as we've seen with recent visits and joint naval exercises. Not because this represents a genuine rapprochement, rather a set of insurance policies against being drawn into a broader regional conflict between Iran, Israel, and perhaps the US. The vulnerability of Saudi Arabia and its GCC neighbors was vividly illustrated by the Iranian-sponsored attacks on Saudi oil installations in 2019 and on Abu Dhabi and Dubai airports in 2022. The fact that the US, under both President Trump and Biden, failed to respond effectively enough, as the Saudis and Emiratis saw it, damaged their confidence in US leadership, capability, and staying power. That confidence was further damaged by the war in Gaza. None of the Arab Gulf rulers are fans of Hamas or Hezbollah any more than the Jordanian or Egyptian governments, quite the contrary. But they cannot pursue their dreams of radical economic reform and visionary socio-economic restructuring, however realistic we may think it, while conflict rages, and while they fear that Iran itself, the prime backer of both groups, might be drawn in. They need order and stability. But order and stability have always been in short supply in the region. The US used to guarantee them. The Iraq War of 2003 shattered that consensus. There has never really been much prospect, in my view, of the sort of security structures that the Helsinki Accords of 1975 produced under an American military umbrella in Europe. And although I helped run a program at Cambridge called the Westphalia Program, I do not think that the lessons of 17th century European history or jurisprudence can easily be read across into the very different circumstances of the contemporary Middle East and North Africa. On top of that, the most powerful military forces in the region belong to Israel and Turkey. Neither state has the same priorities as its Arab neighbors. Israel's fundamental premise, as all Israeli prime ministers have seen it, is the survival of a majority Jewish state in a sea of Arab and Muslim hostility. Pragmatic deals may from time to time be available, but never trust. Turkey, under the AK Party, under Erdogan, sees itself alternately as a neo-Ottoman hegemon and intermediary with an unreliable West, or itself threatened by regional conflict, a predatory West. Ankara has never really forgotten or forgiven Sykes-Picot and its aftermath, and Kurdish separatism. Its neighbors don't agree, so it acts either belligerently or high-handedly, as we see on a more or less daily basis in northern Syria and Iraq. And all these states compete for influence against each other, with Moscow and Beijing, and of course with Washington, all the while distrusting everyone. They recognize that regional security is a collective good, but they also fear being left to fend for themselves or disadvantaged in some way by sneaky deals between others, something in which regional history is rich. And these trends, for me, reflect historical developments in the region that go back at least as far as 1918. But they have been reinforced by the gradual decay of the international order created in 1945 as it adapted to the post-Cold War period from around 1990 to 2010. In that sense, much of what I have described reflects not simply a regional disorder, but an emerging global disorder. And if that is true, it's hard to see how a satisfactory settlement of the Palestinian issue anytime soon, however important it might be in the abstract for Israeli security. It may be that Israel thinks that, given all the other horrors in the region, time is on its side. Iran may believe the same. And both may think that US relative weakness and decline is here to stay. This doesn't mean that China or Russia will step in as external guarantors. Russia doesn't have the capacity, particularly after Ukraine, or the reach. And China doesn't have the will. The US, with its huge bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and its strengthened defense agreements with selected partners in the Gulf, will remain the dominant external player, but with growing constraints on its practical ability to shape events in a political culture in Washington that is highly averse to anything looking like adventurism or a blank check to unreliable partners. And that means what we may all need to prepare ourselves for as the world as a whole rearranges itself into old and new forms of political competition is not the illusion of order, but the management of disorder. Welcome to the millennium.
Palestine. Loads of questions, of course, focusing on this issue. I'll start off with Sean King's question. Why haven't, and you did explain it, but why haven't Egypt and Saudi Arabia supported the Palestinians? You did give us some reasons, but have you any further thoughts on that?
I mean, they both have, actually, over the years. Saudi Arabia, particularly under King Faisal, who had a strong personal attachment to the issue of Jerusalem, was a very powerful advocate of and supporter of the Palestinian cause. And that's been the position of every Saudi king since. If you go back to when the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, so there were various Palestinian groups emerging in the late 1950s. They are consolidated, including Fatah, which was set up in Kuwait by Yasser Arafat and some colleagues. They're consolidated in the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1964. Both Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who at the time locked in their own struggle between Nasser, so between revolutionary Arab nationalism and monarchism, seek to control the Palestinian cause. And Arafat, as I said, actually wrests the Palestinian cause free from the control of regional states. But both Egypt and Saudi Arabia continued to support the Palestinians for years. I mean, the Egyptians would say that they went to war 3 times, in 1948, in 1956, over Syria, and then in 1967, during Nasser's lifetime, and then again in 1973, partly on behalf of the Palestinians. And I think the conclusion that Sadat reached in the 70s was that this was damaging Israel's own interests, particularly its economic prospects for the future, which is why he signed the Camp David Accords in 1978. But Egypt is expelled from the Arab League, blah, blah, blah. But Egypt continues to support the Palestinians in all sorts of general ways. And when I was in Jerusalem, the most informed and effective presence in the Palestinian territories, diplomatic presence, or intelligence diplomatic presence, was the Egyptian intelligence service, Aegis, General Intelligence Service, who down in Gaza, who knew everything that was going on. So when Palestinian factions meet, they will meet they meet quite often in Doha, and have done for some time, but they will meet equally often in Cairo. But the interests of the Palestinians and the interests of regional states are not the same. And that's the fundamental issue in this. And that is one of the things we're seeing now, this divergence. So Saudi Arabia, under King Salman, and particularly under Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has its own agenda, which is about making Saudi Arabia a state fit for the 21st century after the energy transition, which involves massive economic reform, massive funding, massive construction, ambitious projects, education, all sorts of things. A lot of them just think that the Palestinian issue was intractable and is becoming even more intractable, and therefore they need to focus on their own domestic issues at the same time as guarding against the Palestinian issue being used against them. I mean, it's a complicated...
You gave us an interesting historical overview with all those ideas you shared. So, quick one on this, because there isn't time for a history lecture, but Anne Dolson wonders, was the region better under the Ottoman Empire?
Well, not all of it was under the Ottoman Empire, of course. Saudi Arabia, the center of Saudi Arabia, was never really under the Ottomans. The Ottomans controlled the periphery. Large parts of Yemen went under the Ottomans. And Egypt, of course, was always at an angle to the Ottomans. And you have the extraordinary career of Mohammed Ali Pasha, who was the Ottoman viceroy in Egypt in the late 18th, early 19th century, who essentially then seeks to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. It depends where you are. If you were in, I have a very good friend, Iraqi friend, Shia, very prominent Baghdad Shia family, who endowed the Kazimir Shrine, is one of the great Shia shrines in the north of the city, whose aunt was killed in 1958 during the massacre of the monarchy, and Nouri Beshi Said, who was a dominant politician at the time, who was cut to pieces in the street. His aunt was as well. And he says to me, until the end of the 1920s, maybe even the 1930s, if you had a referendum in Iraq, there'd have been a majority in favor of the Ottomans coming back. The Ottomans weren't going to come back because the Ottoman Caliphate had been abolished in 1924. Equally, when I was in Libya in 2011 during the revolution, a lot of the fighters on the insurgent side looked at the Misratans. Misrata is a big city on the Mediterranean just to the east of Tripoli. They called them the Turks because they thought that they were the Turks who never went back to Turkey after the Ottoman Empire was well, actually after the Italians had occupied Libya in 1911, 1912. Memories, so much of this depends on who you're asking. And I'm interested. This is a plug for a book. I'm just reading an extraordinary book by Eugene Rogan, who's head of the Middle East Centre at St Anthony's College at Oxford. It's called the Damascus Events of 1860, which is about the massacres of Christians by Druze, Bedou, and others, which was an extraordinary pogrom come genocide. And it's really interesting to read there about the attitudes that Damascenes had towards the Ottomans in the middle of the 19th century, which was highly ambiguous. My wife is all Austrian, so I have a great affection for multinational empires because I think the end of the Habsburgs was not necessarily a good thing for Europe, as we've seen in the Balkans. So, you can make a case for the Ottomans. The trouble is they're just not going to come back.
No, Eugene was here 10 years ago and gave us a wonderful talk. Sounds like he should be coming back to us in the future. Now, still on the history theme, Robin Dawson. In retrospect, what could Britain have done differently in the 1920s to 40s to prevent some of the chaos in the Middle East today? So I think this is a chance for us to take on a little bit of shame, if you think that's appropriate.
If you go back... So, again, a plug for a book. Brad Fort, who's a distinguished Canadian historian of Britain and other things, has written a very good book on the 1921 Cairo Conference, which is actually pretty sympathetic to what Churchill was trying to achieve, because Churchill essentially was trying to square the different promises we'd given to everybody during the First World War, to the Hashemites, to Ibn Saud, to the French, and to others, in a state of post-war weakness. And I think we forget, actually, how damaging the World War II had been, to not just to the in human terms, but also Britain in the early 1920s was, I wouldn't say bankrupt, but was suffering severe fiscal constraints, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to get all the troops out of Iraq in an uncanny echo of what happened after 2003, between 2003 and 2007. And of course, the demographics. I mean, these were so Jordan at the time, the population of Jordan, what became Jordan, Transjordan, was, I don't know, 200,000. It's about, what is it now, 12 million or something. So you're talking about very sparsely populated areas. Could we have, I think we created a rod for our own backs by, at the same time, by the Balfour Declaration, which says that Her Majesty's government looks favourable on the establishment of a Jewish state in mandated Palestine without prejudice to the civil and political rights of the existing inhabitants. That's an impossible circle to square. You just can't do it. And I think it all rather caught up with us in the end. But there were other actors at the time. It's not just about Britain. France was in Lebanon. You talk to the Lebanese about the French. You talk to the Turks are involved. The Russians are involved. There's all sorts of actors at the time. I mean, looking back, you can always say we should have done lots of things differently. But, you know.
We're here. Right, so I'm going to move away from the history. We may come back to it, because there are 4 questions from 5 members. Listen to their names, and you'll get the drift. Marge and Linda, wondering what and where is the analysis and narrative from a woman's perspective? Linda, the Middle East appears to be totally controlled by old authoritarian and right-wing men. Is there any hope that the young and the liberal and the women can overturn this order? Amy, why is Iran becoming, and this is specific to Iran, why is Iran becoming more and more orthodox and extreme in its religious views and attitudes towards women? And Moira, if women were better thought of in the majority of these countries, may there be more stability?
Well, I mean, speaking as a man, maybe I'm the wrong person to answer those questions.
Well,
but I'm the only person here. There's a fantastic British academic who works in Saudi Arabia called Mark Thompson. We were talking about him earlier, who does a lot of work on the aspirations of Saudi men, and he's launching a project also to gather the same data on the aspirations of Saudi women, which he can't do because he's a man, so he's getting a Saudi woman to do it, and that'll tell us a lot. Starting with Iran, I mean, the issue of the hijab in Iran. So, a friend and colleague of mine, Karim Sajapur, who is a very distinguished scholar of modern Iran in Washington, D.C., says that the three pillars of the Iranian state are death to America, death to Israel, and the hijab. There was a fantastic book written by Madawi al-Rashid, who is a very distinguished historian of modern Saudi Arabia, which is called A Most Masculine State, which is about the way that the Saudi state historically, similarly to the Iranian state today, has sought to define itself by controlling women's bodies, basically, through vestimentary codes, through prescriptions about when you can and cannot leave the house, and so forth. I mean, a lot of this is also essentially about the conflict or the difficulty of applying strict interpretations of Sharia in the context of modern developed or developing states in a hyper-modern globalized order. And that's something that Middle Eastern states have been struggling with since the mid-19th century. Egypt was in advance of everybody else. Although in Egypt, we've seen since the 1970s an increasingly restrictive approach to women's rights in the public square. We saw that in 2011 with women being assaulted in Tahrir Square and elsewhere. When I was in Libya, one of my colleagues, who was a woman, was assaulted when she went downtown to Tahrir Square in Benghazi in exactly the same way. And this is an attempt to drive women out of the public square because there was a traditionalist or a neo-traditionalist view, as it were, that men control the public square, women have a private sphere, but are not supposed to deliberate or decide on issues of great consequence. If you go to the Gulf, if you go to the UAE, and I remember sitting with a very, very senior Emirati official a decade ago, and he was accompanied by 2 extremely smart Emirati women, and he said to me, one of the reasons we don't want the Muslim Brotherhood to have any influence in this country is because they would stop them, pointing to 2 women, working. They would put them in veils and keep them in the house. So it's a big question. A lot of it is in that intersection between Sharia law, contemporary law, culture, custom, and the drive for modernity. And Saudi Arabia, part of this is driven by the need to get women into the workforce as well, of course. So some of this is about neoliberalism. And you see that particularly in Saudi Arabia, where one of the great achievements of Mohammed bin Salman, the reforms, has been to increase the percentage of women in the workforce from about 20%, I think, to about 34% now. That'll only work if the economy as a whole grows and everybody feels that they have chances and there is prosperity.
Since we're taking this sort of broad view across the region at the moment, I'm going to turn to another question from Chris James. I've sought a speaker to give a talk on this subject, so maybe you can just in a couple of minutes give us a view of where do the Kurds fit into this complicated equation?
I shall be up with the Kurds next week. I'm going to Dahuk in northern Iraq on Sunday for a week. Are there any Kurds here, by the way? Just checking. No? I love Kurds. They're fantastic. They're funny. They're bright. The food is fantastic. The Kurds have been seeking self-determination since the 1920s. And every time, when I was ambassador in Baghdad, every time I'd see a Kurd, eventually the conversation would turn to the Treaty of Sèvres, when we had, in 1921, when we had promised the Kurds a state of their own. That collided with reality because the Turks objected. And the problem the Kurds have is where they are, which is between Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, landlocked. They are surrounded by neighbors who will do anything to stop the Kurds getting their own state. The Kurds would accuse, and still accuse us, of selling them down the river, but the reason we sold them down the river because we had other fish to fry, which is why in 1921 at the Cairo conference, T. Lawrence says, I think we should have a Kurdish state. Gertrude Bell, one of the other great sort of Orientalists at the time, turns to him and says, shut up, you little imp, because what her concern was to establish a functional Iraqi state centered on Baghdad. The Kurds tried to have a referendum on Kirkuk, which is essentially a referendum on independence in 2017, 2018, which was collapsed by Baghdad, Tehran, and Ankara, with Qasem Soleimani threatening senior Kurds personally that he would assassinate them if they went ahead with it. That's the problem. I sympathize with the Kurds. I just don't think practically this is going to happen.
I've got loads of questions here. Anyone would like the microphone downstairs or upstairs? Yes, put your hand up if a question comes to you along the way. I'll try to spot you. So I'm going to move on to some questions that are about Israel specifically, and they run as follows. Adrian asks, can you envisage a time in the near future when the USA drastically reduces financial and military aid for Israel? Sean King wonders, why does Britain support Israel and what benefits do we gain by doing so? Steve Hurd, why are the USA, the UK and the EU so reluctant to impose trade and arms sanctions on Israel?
What is the first question? Yeah.
Well, they're all essentially, the first one was about Britain supporting Israel and what benefits do we get any benefits from it?
Okay, to visit your time if you were in the US.
Yeah, it's either it's the UK, the US, it's all the different.
So in terms of the US, people have been talking for years and years and years about the Americans reducing financial support to the Israelis. In the Biden administration, which was publicly quite critical of Israel, but actually increased the funding. I think last year they provided an extra $24 billion worth of military assistance to Israel. Some of this is about the alternatives to Israel in the region. I mean, the issue. Do I think that Israel's neighbours want to destroy it? I think some of them do. Yes, I do. I think the Iranian regime does. One of the interesting things about Iran is it's the only country in the Middle East, I think, where there hasn't been a single popular demonstration against Israel in the last year. There have been a couple, I think, of regime-sponsored demonstrations, but nothing else. But the Iranians have been saying since 1979 that they want to destroy Israel because Israel is a blot in the region, because it's inappropriately, it's Jewish, not Islamic, not Muslim. It inappropriately occupies Jerusalem, which is the third holiest city in Islam, and so forth. So there is an issue. So some of Israel's fears are correct, and it has a right of self-defense. The issue, and you look at the neighbors. I mean, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, all failed states. Syria, in particular, a deeply unpleasant regime. Iraq, controlled by Iran. The support that we give Israel these days is fairly inconsequential in terms of military support. The Americans, it's hugely consequential. Do I think that the Congress, as it's currently constituted, or is likely to be constituted any time in the next 20 years, is going to reduce military support to Israel? No, I don't. And if you look at the nominees for the Trump administration, most of them are extremely pro-Israel. Some of this comes out of the alliance between Jewish groups and originally Southern Democrats who became Republicans from the 1960s onwards, which has been loosened. And I think my point about younger Americans not having the same attachment to Israel is interesting. But that's the trend that we're going to see over the next 30 to 40 years. Ultimately, the issue of a Palestinian state is a political issue. And if you want to... And Israel gets the vote in all of these things. Simply cutting Israel out of the loop or stigmatizing it in a way you don't stigmatize some of the neighbors, I think it won't actually make Israel accede to Palestinian demands. It'll probably make them double down even further. Whether a Palestinian state is actually possible at the moment is another question, or indeed possible ever now, is another question. A lot of people are thinking about alternatives to a single Palestinian state, including a lot of Palestinians and other Arab commentators.
Let's talk about Israel's actions now, and there are three questions here that we'd perhaps sort of explore successively. So, Dave, this may be a conspiracy theory, but he asks, given that the Israeli security services are reputed to be extremely competent and that Israeli border guards were reporting unusual activity before the Hamas attack, do you think Israel was surprised, or was there a deliberate decision to allow the attack to take place? That's a pretty extreme view, isn't it? But I'll let you explore that one. But Richard Tadman, are the actions of the IDF justified by the events of October 2023, and will Israel achieve the eradication of Hamas, or will it just simply destroy Gaza as a place? And John Sherwood shows his colours. Is there any hope for future negotiation if Israel is allowed to keep murdering the opposition negotiators?
I don't think it was a conspiracy at all. I mean, I've heard it said. I don't think any Israeli government would allow whatever it was, 1,500 of its own citizens to be slaughtered as they were. I mean, that was the biggest single mortality count of Israelis ever since the foundation of the state. There were pogroms in the 1920s, but Israel wasn't a state then. I think it was a massive... I think it was a mindset. I think a lot of senior Israelis... I mean, you're right. I mean, there was a lot of intelligence reporting at the time that something was moving. And reportedly, the head of military intelligence was on holiday somewhere and didn't get out of bed when he was warned a day or so before this was going to happen. So it's a massive failure of institutional readiness. What is the other?
Well, that was the question about the attack itself, and then the other questions are about the consequences. Are the IDF justified in all the actions they're taking, or are they just going to destroy Gaza as a place, or will they succeed?
I mean, if you look at it, I mean, the Israelis from the earliest days developed a doctrine of massive response to any attack on it, and this was. I mean, first of all, there was a sort of Samson doctrine, which said that we have nuclear weapons. They let it be known, although they neither confirmed nor denied that they had nuclear weapons, that if they were in serious trouble, they would take the region down with them. And I think that has spread across into military doctrine more widely, that you respond with maximum force to any attack upon you, because that deters the enemy. Of course, the human cost is massive. there's an issue, I mean, in terms of whether these war crimes have been committed in Gaza and so forth. That's a matter for international courts. My assumption is that yes, they have. But the laws of war, the jus ad bellum and jus in bello, so are extremely complicated. I'm not a lawyer. Will they? Hamas. So people say you can't destroy an idea. Actually, you can destroy an idea. I mean, nobody talks these days about the Albigensians, or indeed the Nazi Party in Germany, apart from 3 or 4 people in Saxony who like dressing up and pretending they are still representatives of the NSDAP. So you can destroy an idea if you want. The trouble for Israel is they're small and their opponents are legion. What they can do is dismantle the structures of Hamas and of Hezbollah to such an extent that Hamas cannot or will not come back to power in Gaza. And they can reduce Hezbollah's missile arsenal to the extent where it no longer represents a threat to the communities of the north of Israel, whatever it is, 50 to 70,000 of whom have fled and are living in hotels at the moment. The trouble is, Clausewitz famously says that war is a continuation of politics by other means. Ludendorff, who was the chief of staff during the First World War, wrote a book called On Total War in the 1930s, where he says the opposite. Actually, war is a continuation of politics by other means. At the moment, the IDF look as if they're Ludendorffians, that war is the aim. Actually, you need to have a political solution to this. You need to have a political settlement which provides for the administration of Gaza, the relief of Gaza, the reconstruction of Gaza, and so forth, and indeed in the south. Now, there's a lot of talk about this. I don't know whether it's going to happen. There are a lot of people who say that the objective of the IDF in Gaza is to depopulate northern Gaza, so drive people down towards the Netzarim Road, which is the road that cut Gaza in half, and use that as a buffer zone. Some people say that the religious settler right want to rebuild settlements in Gaza, and some people say that what they really want to do is to expel Palestinians from Gaza entirely, as they want to do in the West Bank. I don't think that's achievable. On a logistical level, I don't think Palestinians will leave unless they're forced to leave. Simply driving Palestinians into Sinai doesn't make them any less vengeful, or indeed into Jordan, which would in turn actually probably collapse the Jordanian state. So there's all sorts of... My fundamental point is this is essentially a political problem to which you need a political solution.
Right, well, let's talk a little bit about the role of external powers in that. Questions about the US, and these are rather different questions, John, but maybe we can sort of explore them together. Ian Watson was wondering, did the American incursions into Iraq and Afghanistan after 2003 damage the prospects for peace in the area beyond repair? So do we have to, he wonders whether you blame it all on that. Julia is wondering, she's saying, well, since the US strategy of taking out hostile group leaders in the Middle East is failing, how could Trump effectively counter these ever-emerging threats by the Iranian axis or their proxies? Has the US got any useful strategies to contribute, or is it just really a Buster's flush because of what it did in the past?
I mean, the invasion of Afghanistan was designed to topple the Taliban because they had given shelter to Al-Qaeda, and they were refusing to hand Al-Qaeda, who had been responsible for the 9/11 attacks, over. So there was a genuine casus belli, and I think, although I'm not a lawyer, in terms of legality, it was entirely legal. What happened, of course, was that they got sidetracked by these fantasies about Iraq, about Saddam being responsible for Al-Qaeda, for sponsoring other terrorist attacks and so forth, which we now know to have been complete bunkum, and indeed the weapons of mass destruction, which again was entirely bunkum. Although it's fair to say that the UN weapons inspectors at the time still believed that Saddam was concealing weapons of mass destruction. Afghanistan was justified, but the end of it, whenever it was 2 years ago, the withdrawal from Kabul was an absolute fiasco. The invasion of Iraq was a disaster for all sorts of reasons. Not that Saddam was a nice guy, he wasn't at all. but it collapsed an essential part of the Arab world's bulwark against Iran. And Iran was much better prepared for exploiting this than we were, partly because they had religious links, trade links, social links, and so forth. And I think, essentially, and the Arabs themselves, and I've sat in meetings with Arab leaders when they said, you were responsible for handing Iraq over to the Iranians, which is true. It may be that the Iranians have overstretched themselves, because the Iranians themselves, I think, have thought that the Iranian project is essentially an imperial project. It's certainly I think it's an ethno-imperial project. And I think they now have massive problems. A lot of these are economic. One of the reasons that Khamenei agreed to the talks with the Americans that led to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Nuclear File, in whatever it was, 2015, the spring of 2015, was because he was convinced that the Iranian economy was about to go down the tube, seriously. And a large part of that was because the Iranian economy had been cut off from the international banking system, from SWIFT. So they were cut off from global trade. They couldn't transfer, they couldn't do deals in dollars. That remains, I think, the most serious weakness that Iran has. And I don't think the Iranian regime, which still talks about a resistance economy, is capable of fixing that. I think most Iranians want a different regime. There's a huge brain drain in Iran, and there has been for 35 to 40 years. This is not sustainable. In terms of actually decapitation strategies, actually the IDF have been, when the IDF did this before with Hamas in 2002, 2003, 2004, they essentially lowered the average age of the Hamas leadership, which made them more risk prone. That doesn't seem to be the case this time. They have done an extraordinary job in taking out entire layers of command and control in Hezbollah and Hamas. They will rejuvenate after a while. Well, they will repair themselves after a while. But whether they'll ever be the same organizations ever again, I don't know. But again, it kind of comes back to my point. You have to, this is a way of reaching a political settlement, which is not in prospect at the moment, but which needs to be in prospect.
I'd like to ask you a question. I'm going to take a bit of a risk with this one, because I don't fully comprehend it myself, but you do. I know you do. So you will briefly explain to the audience what's behind the question and then give us your thoughts, because it does relate to the talk you've given us. From David Hudson, is the use of dawah by factions of political Islam more dangerous than the use of terrorism by fundamental Islam?
So dawah is the Islamic call. I mean, it means different things. It has a variety of meanings in Arabic, but in this context, it's a call to Islam. So it's used to describe outreach, it's used to describe preaching, it's used to describe the way in which you persuade people to embrace Islam or to re-embrace Islam, Muslims who have strayed from the path. So Hassan al-Banna, who's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, who founds it in 1928, described himself as a da'i, as a preacher, not as an activist. But it's a highly ideological form of preaching, because because Islamism itself is a modernist ideological mobilization of religious identity for political purposes in modern states. There is not a clear distinction. I mean, I think you will find. So if you remember when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi emerges as the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq, and the Islamic State capture Mosul, and he stands up in the mosque on the pulpit of the great Nuruddin Mosque in Mosul, dressed in black robes like a preacher. He is actually a trained Islamic scholar. He was a trained Islamic scholar, and he had been probably a Muslim brother in his youth, and then had become more extreme. But for him, preaching and killing people were parts of the same thing. So sometimes it's quite hard to detect a difference in the activity of organizations like Al-Qaeda, which do both dawah and also extreme violence. There is a bigger argument about the Muslim Brotherhood, about whether the Muslim Brotherhood is committed to peaceful means of achieving its goal of Islamizing society and eventually Islamizing the state, or whether it is prepared to use violence as well. In my view, it is prepared to use violence when it needs to. Whether this relates, so there's a regional issue to this. There's also, of course, an issue in the West, where significant Muslim populations have arisen since the late 1950s, 1960s, which is a unique situation for Muslims, because most Muslims historically lived in Muslim-majority states under varieties of Islamic law. They're now living in Western states which have secular, rationally discovered law, which is essentially based on Roman law, which is different. So there has arisen a variety of what is called of Islamic jurisprudence to address the needs of minorities, Muslim minorities in non-Muslim states, which is a very, very unusual situation for Muslim communities historically. And some of these are to do with integration, and a lot of them are to do with preserving a Muslim identity and also inviting everybody else to come to Islam. I think there are issues of social cohesion, social tension and so forth, and integration, which are involved in that, which are far too great for me to address now. But I've written on this subject for Policy Exchange, so if anybody wants to read my stuff, just go on the Policy Exchange website and see.
Right, I'm now going to have two questions about Iran. One's looking back, one's looking forward. Ian Durdoth, how significant was Trump's ending of a nuclear deal with Iran? And looking forward, Don Muir, given the malign influence of Iran across much of the region, how might a collapse of their religious leadership change geopolitics in the Middle East?
So the JCPOA was, of course, designed to address Iran's nuclear weapons program. Iran denied that it had sought to weaponize, to produce weapons, to weaponize the enriched uranium, since it had abandoned weapons development research since 2002. I'm not sure I believe that, actually, because we saw a lot of evidence that they hadn't. So I think they always had they wanted to keep the option open of developing nuclear weapons. And when Khamenei issues the so-called fatwa 20 years ago saying nuclear weapons are un-Islamic, it wasn't actually a fatwa. And even if you have a fatwa, you can reject. So I think the danger was real and present, and I think the JCPOA was a reasonable attempt to try and deal with that. It was flawed, not least because it focused so much on the nuclear file and not so much on the ballistic missiles file, which was also a massive problem for Iran's neighbors, and indeed Iran's malign activities in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and increasingly Yemen, which is something the regional states, the Gulf states in particular, felt very uncomfortable with. What the JCPOA did was buy us time, 15 years, because if you look at the sunset clauses in the JCPOA, there were different sort of timelines, but the whole thing was designed to last 15 years when, at the end of 15 years, the enhanced inspections, the sanctions and so forth, which would be gradually released, would all come to an end, and everybody would live happily together ever after. The trouble was, I think the Obama administration came to see the JCPOA as a diplomatic triumph in itself. And you could do this, you could then forget about Iran, move on from that to dealing with China, which is part of this attempt to pivot to Asia. And 15 years for the Iranians is nothing. We're now 9 years out from the JCPOA, so we're only another 6 years when these sunset clauses would have kicked in. It was much better to have it than not to have it. But Trump, the withdrawal from the JCPOA expressed a view which is not just a Trumpian view, but which is held by a variety of other hawkish figures in the United States, that Iran needs a policy of maximum pressure, which I expect is something we will return to with this administration. What was the other question?
You've covered it.
I'm covered. Okay.
Yes, because I'd now like to take us to the final question, or set of questions, because they're looking to the future. They're different, so it makes it challenging for you to give us some thoughts. Tony MacDonald, it seems to me that most of the problems in the Middle East are religious. Will we ever get a Good Friday agreement? Is how he puts it. Jeff Elliott, Cathy Ashton talked, and she was here, as you know, a month ago, talked about small steps to move diplomacy forwards. So Jeff wonders, are there any small steps possible in the Middle East? And Jane has a plea. Is there any glimmer of hope?
What was the first question again? Can you remind me?
First question's about, the religion
Oh, yes.
and Good Friday Agreement. Anything equivalent?
Well, I mean, Jonathan Powell is now back in number 10 as National Security Advisor. Jonathan Powell, of course, was one of the architects of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes, but Blair was also wandering around the region, wasn't he, some years back, trying to be a peace broker?
Tony Blair still wanders on. Well, yes, he was the Middle East. He was the quartet envoy. He's still heavily involved.
A religious equivalent to Good Friday.
The interesting thing. I've heard lots of people in my career say, it's not just the Middle East as religious problems. Look at Northern Ireland. Look at the IOA. I'm Catholic myself. I'm of Irish, partly of Irish origin. And my response to that is actually the IOA. The clue's in the name. It's the Irish Republican Army. It's not the Irish Papal Army or it's the Irish Catholic Army. I mean, the IOA didn't want to impose canon law on Northern Ireland. There were a bunch of ethno-nationalists who'd read a bit of Marx. So it was different. And the fact is, the IOA, the real parallel with what happened to the Good Friday Agreement was the Evian Agreement, which ended the Algerian Civil War in 1962. In both cases, the military forces of the insurgents had been defeated. The PIRA had been defeated by the British Army, and the FLN had been defeated by the French Army. Politically, it was different. You needed a political settlement that gave something to everybody, and we got that with the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, I don't think the Good Friday Agreement is perfect. I think there were various flaws in it, particularly the way in which it dealt with historic violence and historic murders. But it's much better than the alternative. Will you ever get that in the Middle East? You're not dealing with just two parties. I mean, with PIRA, we were talking about it was us, the IOA, the Unionists, and the Republic, with American help. It was a fairly simple equation. It's not simple in the Middle East. Religion in the Middle East, yeah, sure. It's a blessing, but it's also a curse because of religious identity. I mean, and you have to remember that a lot of Middle Eastern societies remain heavily clan-based, which is, and Europe is not clan-based. I mean, it's one of the things that make Europe, as it were, weird. It's not, and it hasn't been clan-based since probably the 11th century. So there are different political sociologies, and the important part of the political sociology of the Middle East is religion. Islam has a very powerful way of talking about injustice, about social justice, about political problems. It doesn't have an answer to them. So when the Muslim brothers go around saying, which is their slogan, Islam huwa al-hal, Islam is the solution, it's a solution to what problem? Because if you look at how when Islamists have come to power in Iran, in Sudan, in Gaza, they don't solve the problems. They just make it a lot worse. How do you resolve this? I don't know. Mohammed bin Salman, and indeed the Sheikh of Al-Azhar in Egypt, the senior Sunni cleric in the Middle East, and President Sisi, who may not be the best person to talk about it, talk about going back to the basis of Islam, which of course is a sort of is a story they tell themselves that Islam once was a progressive. I mean, you can argue about this, but it's what they clearly want is to make Islam in some way more private than public, which is one of the issues. I mean, classically, what the Enlightenment did in Europe was to privatize religion. Now, you can't do that with Islam. Islam is a political religion as much as it is a metaphysical religion. But there are ways of functioning perfectly well in Islamic states, in Muslim majority states, the classical Islamic states, the Umayyad Empire, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Tulunids, you name it, the Ottomans, all functioned properly as Islamic states within a broader state system which was not just Islamic.
Thank you, John, for that.
You're welcome.
There we're going to leave it, ladies and gentlemen, because we need to get away. This talk tonight, I thought, was engrossing. There was a lot in it. Densely packed, wasn't there? I'm pleased to say we've got approval for the video of that. Eventually, that will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website for those of you who'd like to go back over what Sir John has shared with us tonight. And I'd like to thank him also for his very deep thoughts during the Q&A, dealing with your usual bunch of googlies. I hope you want to leave here slightly less confused than when you arrived. And perhaps you will go away with some deeper thoughts about this complex region than when you arrived.
Say one more thing,
Yes, do.
which is simply the big business about hope. Yes, I do think it's hope, and I was talking in the interval actually to Sam. You go to the Middle East, the energy among young people is extraordinary, and it is a largely young society. You look at the energy in arts, in literature, in music, in the desire to have a better life, the desire to make something, in other countries. It's huge. The task is to harness that, which has to be done by governments, and that's their task, not ours.
Thank you for that last positive
Yes.
point to end tonight. Thank you, Sir John Jenkins.